before we do conclude breakfast in the desert this morning. But just before we do, there's still a whole lot to uncover and to pack. Earlier this month, the Ministry of Mines and Energy held a national workshop on developing a local content policy for the oil and gas industry. We do know there's been a lot of news regarding oil and gas in the country, and we are, facing what they have termed an oil regime in the country. Now, the policy requires oil and gas license holders to produce an annual local content plan, which will include a section on procurement detailing the involvement of local firms in supplying goods and services. Now, public policy analyst and executive director at the Institute for Public Policy Research is Graham Hopwood. Has joined us this morning to further unpack existing laws and policies, and also to talk on what type of laws we will need in an oil regime, as well as to just talk a little bit about that national workshop. Graham, good morning.
Yeah, good morning, John Colin.
Thank you so much for making some time for us this morning. I think just perhaps for context for our listeners, that recent national workshop on developing a local content policy for the oil and gas industries, of course, having generated, a significant interest. Perhaps just give us an overview of the key objectives that came from that particular workshop, and of course how it aims to promote local participation and development in the oil sector. What did you make of that?
Well, yeah, one of the big benefits that will come from the development of oil is that the rate of tax and royalties that these companies that are doing the production pay will bring in a massive amount of money into the government's coffers. So it's possible that government's revenue could double or triple once these oil fields are going. So the thing is, of course, that, not everybody, when we see this in things like the Afrobarometer, trust the government, or there's declining levels of trust in the government. So I think for ordinary Namibians, they need to know there's other ways of benefiting, other ways that businesses and people in general, communities can benefit from the discovery of the oil. So one of the key parts of that is what we call local content policy, which means that Namibians are heavily involved in the supply chain for the developing oil industry, which means that a policy would favor Namibian companies to be involved in all kinds of supply service operations for the oil industry as it develops. So that can be everything from specialized engineering, from harbor services, right through to cleaning and catering services and so on. So the idea behind the workshop was to look at how that could be done, probably with some kind of rule that the companies will have to give preference, the international oil companies will have to give preference to companies that are at least 51% owned by Namibians when they hand out their procurement contracts. Of course, there will be some areas where Namibians don't have the necessary skills or capacity, but the other point of the workshop was to try and work out or find a way of working out where we do have gaps that we could still fill, so where we could do more training and development and develop certain businesses so they could actually fulfill these roles, and Namibians then can see more practical benefits coming out of these oil discoveries. So that's the whole gist behind the idea of local content, that Namibians, in a very sort of practical, direct way, are able to benefit from these oil discoveries.
Indeed. And then, Graham, just looking at, current policies and laws that we have right now, are there any that, make sure that there will be responsible and equitable sort of exploitation of oil and gas resources as we speak right now in the country, or do we still have to look at drafting laws that can promote such an environment?
So, a lot changes once the oil discoveries have been confirmed and these international oil companies go into production. So we don't really have the legislation in place at the moment. Our legislation is more geared around exploration, because that's what's been happening since independence. So we're going to have to think about how the petroleum law, petroleum taxation law, and the regulations are apply in this case, and where we need to make some amendments. So it's likely that there will be changes to these laws, and one of those, or some of those changes, will concern local content. So yeah, we do definitely need to do some thinking, because there's probably sort of at least 8-year gap now till when production starts, because of the need to confirm the oil reserves, and then secondly, of course, the difficult technical issues around trying to drill for oil in very deep water, quite a way offshore. We probably do have about 8 years before production starts properly. So we need, in the next 2 to 3 years, we need to move towards a legislation that really makes sense, that is fair in terms of the risks and investments that the international oil companies have already made, but also is very clear that how Namibians can benefit from these discoveries.
Now, Graham, married to the success of a local content policy is effective monitoring and enforcement mechanisms, right? So, just from a public policy point of view, what mechanisms or perhaps even institutions do you think should be established to oversee the implementation of the policy, and of course also ensure that compliance by oil and gas companies is one that's prioritized in this space?
Yeah, so we had international speakers at this workshop, and although I don't think there was enough emphasis on transparency and accountability, it's clear from experiences in Angola and Nigeria, for example, that local content policies have been abused to benefit, politically connected elites, rather than sort of genuine business people who aren't aligned in terms of their politics, are unrelated to leading politicians or officials and so on. So we have to guard against that in Namibia. We have to develop a system for local content which does encourage Namibian businesses to get involved and does incentivize the international oil companies to give contracts to Namibian businesses. But at the same time, it has to be a level playing field. There has to be transparency and accountability, and conflict of interest has to be ruled out. So we need to develop that, and there are various ways we can do that. I mean, the contracts between the government and the oil companies can stipulate all kinds of anti-corruption measures, promises to not indulge in bribery and so on, which could attract major punishment if contravened. And then oversight bodies. So we probably do need an independent oversight body, not directly under government or not dominated by government, which can monitor the allocation of contracts. If there is going to be any kind of pre-selection of companies that are qualifying because they have the skills, the knowledge, capacity, and so on, then that should be very carefully done and monitored, so that it isn't just stacked full of politically connected people, and as has happened in the oil exploration, the children of ministers or ex-ministers and so on. So we really have to move away from that era, the way we handed out the petroleum exploration licenses, which was, in terms of its Namibianization elements, was I think, certainly unethical and probably corrupt in the way that it was done. So, we really have to work now to make sure we have the transparency and accountability systems in place. And I think the Minister, Alwendo, did, make that clear right at the beginning of that local content workshop, that, we can't afford to go down the road of allowing this policy, which could be so important for Namibia, to be used by corrupt elements.
8:40 is the time on the clock this morning. We are in conversation with Executive Director of the Institute for Public Policy Research, Graham Hopwood, speaking on while the country developing a local content policy for the oil and gas industries, seeing that Namibia is slowly but surely heading into an oil and gas regime. As we start while closing down the conversation, Graham, we do know that across the world, we've seen local content policies often face challenges and sort of potential trade-offs of some sort between local participation and international competitiveness. Just speak to us in terms of what the best practices are, or strategies perhaps, to sort of mitigate potential conflicts and create, win-win situations, for lack of better words, for both local and international actors.
Well, one thing that needs to be done pretty soon is some kind of enterprise survey and skills survey, which looks at what skills will be needed for these industries that are developing in Namibia and industries of the future like green hydrogen. Where do we have some capacity already? But more importantly, where do we have the potential to develop capacity, knowledge, and skills, and the kind of businesses that could play serious roles in this? Because otherwise, what would happen is that companies from South Africa or Angola that have some experience in these areas already, or international companies, and Halliburton, for example, which is involved in service support for oil and gas around the world, is already in Namibia, establishing itself and these companies move very quickly and occupy spaces. So, and those companies can obviously do some of the more sophisticated, high-level stuff that maybe we won't be able to do. But there must be plenty of opportunities for Namibian companies, but we need to identify them. We need to train people, whether it's vocational training or whether it's UNAM and NUST offering specialized courses and hands-on support for these kind of emerging businesses, so that they can play a role. So that's one of the main aspects. I mean, otherwise, the argument that we'll have to just let the foreign companies do this because they have the expertise. The oil industry is so high tech now that that will be an argument in some instances, but we have to make sure that Namibian businesses are well positioned within the next 2 or 3 years to take up other opportunities, which there will be quite a number of, in terms of supplying the oil industry and servicing the oil industry.
And then just before we let you go, Graham, in light of what you've mentioned already, especially just looking at, experiences from other countries, what do you think should be of key priority when we are looking at the experiences of other countries like Angola, like Nigeria, especially in Africa, countries that have, sort of adopted an old regime of some sort? What lessons can be learned from them that have implemented either successful local content policies or not? But what key areas should we be looking at in that regard?
I think there needs to be more research into working out what lessons we can learn from good examples. Guyana is often mentioned as a recent, relatively good example, and also bad examples that we've already mentioned. So there is definitely, need for IPPR and others to do some further detailed research in these areas. But generally, the principle seems to be that to avoid the oil resource curse that has hit so many countries, where there's mass corruption and economies don't develop because everything is focused on oil, and the benefits don't flow through to the vast portion of the population. We have to have systems that are transparent and accountable. So it means publishing contracts between government and the private sector. It means making a lot of data available, including all the production figures and the money that's being generated, revenue that government's receiving, how government spends the revenue. All these are actually part of the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, which government is also considering joining, which would be a very good move because it would commit us to all these kind of things in one go, to developing these systems and meeting these standards. So I think that those are the ways that we can, A, minimize corruption risks, but B, maximize benefits in terms of making sure this resource, which, is time bound as well, and also the world is moving gradually against fossil fuels. So we probably don't have